Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. This is our 420 What's the Buzz roundtable, where we're going to be hearing from Canadian youth on what they think about cannabis legalization in 2024. So before we get started, I did want to quickly mention that we are a national organization with the Cannabis and Mental Health Project, and we are joining you from across Turtle Island, which is also known as Canada. Before we get started, we're going to do a little round of introductions. I guess I can start. My name is Michaela. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a research lead with the Cannabis and Mental Health Project, and I am joining you from Toronto, which is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Wedop people. So that's me. I'm going to pass it on to, let's see, Connor. Throw it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Connor Lafortune. I am from Dukis First Nation, but I'm currently located in Swakmuk, which is colonially known as Sudbury, on Robinson Huron Treaty Territory of 1850, which is my treaty territory as well. But this is the home of the Atikameksheng First Nation and Wanapitei First Nation. I use he, him pronouns. I will pass it on to Heath.
Thanks, Connor. Hi, everyone. My name is Heath. I use they, them pronouns. I am joining from Tiohtià:ke, or colonially known as Montreal. And I grew up in Cornwall, Ontario, on Akwesasne Mohawk territory. And I am a strategic advisor for the Cannabis and Mental Health Project and a person with lived experience of cannabis use and psychosis. And I'm so excited to be part of the conversation today. Haha, I will pass it over to Vijay.
Thank you, Heath. Hi, everyone. My name is Vijay. I am the research coordinator for the Cannabis and Mental Health Project. I use the pronouns he, him. And I'm joining from East Toronto. So I reside in the traditional land of Anishinaabe and the Métis. So I will pass it over to Kia.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Kia, or Kiki today, because I'm feeling that. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a strategic advisor for the Cannabis and Mental Health Project. I'm located in White Rock, British Columbia, on the lands of the Semiahmoo Nation. And yeah, really excited for today's chats. I'll pass it off to Herline.
Hi, everyone. My name is Herline. My pronouns are she, her. I'm part of the Youth Action Committee, and I'm based in Toronto under the Anishinaabe Indigenous peoples, and I'll pass it on to Lavanya.
Hey guys, my name is Lavanya, and I'm also a Youth Action Committee member. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also based in Toronto on Anishinaabe land. And I'll pass it on to Jelani.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chilani, member of the Youth Action Committee for the Cannabis and Mental Health Project. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm also located on Toronto, or specifically known as Anishinaabe lands. I'll also pass it over to Liba.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liba. I'm on the Youth Action Committee. My pronouns are she, her. I'm visiting Philadelphia right now, but I'm originally from the Anishinaabe lands in Toronto. And I will pass it over to Kavisha.
Thank you. My name is Kavisha, and I'm from Grey Bruce, also known traditionally as the land of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Haudenosaunee. And I'm also a part of the Youth Action Committee.
Amazing. I think that's everyone. Thanks so much for introducing yourselves, and I'm looking forward to starting this conversation. I'm going to throw it over to you, Heath, and you can give us a little walkthrough of what 420 even means and the significance of that.
So today we're getting together to celebrate 420, to talk about 420. What is the buzz about 420? What is it? Where did it come from? What's it all about? So let's get into the history lesson. What is 420? 420, it's a time of day and it's a day of the year. You know, 420 happens once a day and it happens once a year. And what it signifies, you know, it represents an act of civil disobedience. Sometimes, especially in places where cannabis is still illegal, is it still an act of disobedience? to be determined. We'll talk about that, I guess. It's kind of considered like a counterculture holiday and a time to celebrate and a time to act, you know, and to smoke weed often for a lot of people. But where does it come from? Why did 420 start meaning weed in the first place? And I think it's interesting. I did just pull this from Wikipedia, and I know it's bad education and research practice. I just think it's funny that 420 has a Wikipedia page, and I don't know why I think that's funny, but I do. So essentially, yeah, 420 started in the 70s. It was started by a group of high school students in California, a group of friends that called themselves the Waldos. And allegedly, the legend foretells that 420 was supposed to be related to like a plan for finding this like secret hidden cannabis crop that like was like a treasure map left by the grower that went nowhere, an urban myth, if you will. But they gave up. The Waldos was the name of this group. They gave up on their search for the magical, mystical, secret 420 crop. And then it kind of just started to mean like 4:20 p.m., like right around the time that class let out, the time that they would get together at the statue, 420 Louis, and they would get together to smoke weed. I think part of what I find interesting about it is that it was started by teenagers. Is that like 420, this like massive cultural movement that became like somewhat of like a global initiative and like a celebration every year, was started by young people. And like to this day, a lot of drug policy movements are still like very much pioneered and led by young people who are very passionate, because so much of the conversation around drugs is like protecting young people. Meanwhile, young people are like, it's 420. Anyway, so yeah, historically, what has it been about? It's been about youth leadership, human rights, people's right to consume cannabis without being criminalized if they want. It's been about political movements. It's about celebration, and it's been about community, and it's about people coming together over their shared passion for cannabis. And then, yeah, it's got events that happen on April 20th all over the country, as well as like in places all over the world. I just have some like photos of some of the 420 events that happen in so-called Canada. 420 on Parliament Hill is a big one because it's in like the capital of Canada. Ottawa is seen as maybe a bit of a typically kind of boring part of this country. But every year everyone goes to Parliament and smokes a bunch of weed on the lawn in front of the government buildings. And I think that that's kind of funny and interesting. Tam Tams is something that happens in Montreal. Every Sunday, people get together to smoke weed in Parc Montreal. But yeah, on 420, I think it's just kind of the same thing. It's a lot of people getting together, like playing music and hanging out on the lawn. And then I have a clip of Vancouver, because we can't forget about Vancouver, because they fancy themselves to be very central to the cannabis movement in Canada. That brings me to the end of my presentation. It really was not very much, but I kind of just wanted to set the tone, I guess, in terms of like the history, because it's been this like act of civil disobedience, this like act of celebration, and this time for reflection. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about in many facets throughout the course of our conversation today. Weed's legal now. How does that change what 420 means to us? Are we still doing 420? That's the question. So I'm gonna stop there, because that's really, I made 4 slides. I don't want to take up too much time because I want to have like a group conversation. But yeah, I guess that's where I kind of want to open up the conversation. I guess in terms of what 420 means to everyone on the call. I've gone to some of the 420 events. I've gone to the one in Ottawa when I lived there, and I go to Tam Tam sometimes. And like sometimes it's fun and exciting. Often like the cops do kind of show up after like maybe 7 p.m. And then like every time I feel like I try and bring friends to Tam Tams, the cops always show up, and then we're kind of like, this is killing the vibe. We have to leave now. But I don't know. I guess I'll just stop there. I don't know if other people want to chime in about like, well, I guess we're going to get into like what it means to us collectively down the line. I feel like Key and Connor, you were going to talk about that, but we were going to talk, I guess, about like the cultural significance of it. I don't know if anyone has a burning desire to chime in, or like thoughts on 420, if they've ever been to a 420 event, or like what they think of when they think of 420. I don't know if that's like a starting point or a jumping off point.
I guess I'd like to share. um Growing up in like BC and like close enough to Vancouver, like 420 to me, like in my head is like free joints, because when you could see in the picture that Heath showed, we would like meet in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery, and you, no matter your age, you would magically find a joint in your hand, and this was pre-legalization, so it was like there's definitely a certain energy to 420 when I was younger. And then as well, when I was living in Montreal, of course, you gotta go to Tams. But as Heath mentioned, there's like police presence there, because Tams is like a very like cannabis and also just like substance use, like forward and positive type of environment. So that often not warrants cops being there, but cops flock there sometimes. But yeah, I guess like that's kind of my like cultural significance in terms of just growing up in BC. And now like 420, it's interesting because I'm still trying to figure out like what it is. And I know that there's a lot of different organizations in BC. Like there's a program called the Cannabis Substitution Program here, which you can kind of my screen might be. They're hosting some 420 events, and the Cannabis Substitution Program is a program for people that are addicted to opiates or trying to use less opiates, and supplementing their use with cannabis. So there's an event happening through them, and then as well, different like younger community-driven events happening in Vancouver with more free weed. So I don't know if that's like the best answer, but in my head, it's synonymous with like sharing stories and sharing bud, essentially. Curious to hear from other people though.
I can add on a little bit to that. So, personally myself, I haven't been to a 420 event, but in Toronto, everyone knows Yonge and Dundas, when it happens, that's the place to go. Kind of crazy people do it in the middle of downtown with the most police presence, but it's kind of like the fact that in the past, a lot of people thought of it as a sort of rebellious act because prohibitionist policies that a lot of sorry, with the prohibitionist policies that Canada and the United States implemented, a lot of people frowned upon the use of it. So people who used it kind of had a rebellious approach or a rebellious stigma to them. But now I kind of look at it as a sort of celebration or a growing realization that both countries are moving away from kind of the prohibitionist kind of mindset that they had towards substance abuse. And I kind of embrace it or moving towards a more harm reduction kind of sense. So I feel like that's how the history and the social impact of 420 changed from the beginning of when I heard it till now in 2024.
Yeah, I think that there's always like this present change of what 420 can mean, also in different contexts. Like I grew up in a very small town, and so 420 was very much so either a very like high school thing to do or a very dad thing to do of just like, yeah, let's do this for 420. And then as I've grown and also like being a queer Indigenous person, there is different ways that our communities have adapted to those terms. And so whenever if you're like scrolling on an app like Tinder and you see like 420 friendly, like that's become a very like synonymous with queerness and the way that we operate in the world and the way that we kind of live on the outside, but we also are very abolitionists in the way that we are there for whatever folks need to feel better. And then in the Indigenous communities, there's also a very specific way that cannabis is used, and the way that 420 kind of plays into that as both a celebration and a reclamation. For a lot of folks too, it's about reclaiming medicines. And so we have a lot of different traditional medicines that we use, and 420 comes into play when it's combining those medicines. I myself make a lot of salves, and with my traditional medicines, also combining with things like cannabis and CBD oils and things like that. And it's about reclaiming those spaces and affirming those connections in any way you see fit, which I think is really interesting because that aspect of 420 meaning something specific is so untrue when you look at the way that it manifests itself in different communities.
Also wanting to recognize that Hargan has entered the chat. And Hargan, if you want to say your name, your pronouns, and where you are, and how you're connected to the project, just so that folks know what's up. And welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm really sorry for being late. We were just finishing up here. My name is Hargan. My pronouns are she, her. I've been with the project for a couple of years now as working on the youth advisory committee and you know, with different aspects of the cannabis and psychosis and later cannabis and mental health project. I'm currently a medical student at McMaster, and I'm actually located at the Hamilton General Hospital right now. So Hamilton, just finishing up here, but excited to be joining in for the tail end of the rest of the presentation.
You know what you're gonna say? Ooh, I was just gonna bring Hargan up to speed also just on like where we're at. We were kind of just I gave like a little brief intro about like the history of 420, that it started as like a youth-led movement. And like talking about kind of where it's going, and we're all kind of reflecting on, I guess, yeah, like the cultural importance of 420 and what it means to us. I related, Connor, to what you were saying too about like queer community, and like when I was thinking about like 420 culture, like definitely like seeing 420 in people's like dating bios, or just like, I don't know, recognize like even when people are looking for roommates, it's like a 420 friendly household. Like people will like be explicit about that because it is something, I don't know, just like to consider, I guess, like stoner identity and like the way we relate to it. And then I guess, yeah, like also Jelani, to your point of like it being such a rebellious thing, especially pre-legalization. Like, I don't know, when I was a teenager, I definitely was like, 420 means skipping school and like hanging out with my friends, and everybody's gonna know where I am because I'm not at school on 420 or whatever. But then like, I mean, part of that was because I was like a teenager, so it is still like not really legal for teenagers to do it necessarily. But I don't know. I guess like I don't know if there was anything like, I don't know, you were talking about how it's changed like in the context of the war on drugs. Like I don't know. It used to be such a rebellious act. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to like say just kind of about that, about the context of 420 within the war on drugs.
I did want to add on to some of the stuff that he just mentioned. I think like when I was younger, obviously like I was in high school, so there's obviously the age factor, and then this was pre-legalization. So I think at that time there was a like at least in the group that I was in my experience, there was a much different perception, like everyone has already kind of mentioned. Like it was more rebellious. It was more of like the rebellious cool thing to do. Again, only like in my context, what I experienced. But I think as we got older, that same friend group, and it got legalized, we also got older. I saw those same people, who were celebrating it, and like you said, skipping school. It didn't hold as much significance for them anymore as it did. Again, I don't know if it's the factor of being younger, if it's pre-legalization, it's just cooler to do it. You want to do those kind of things. So I definitely did notice that in my experience as well.
I definitely agree with what Liba was saying, and also like what Jelani was saying about how it was seen as such a rebellious thing before. And even I was thinking that, like growing up, I'd see it on the news. I'm like, oh my God, everyone's doing something illegal on this day. Like what? I obviously don't think that now. And I think that society has become way more accepting of it post legalization. Like you're not gonna be so surprised seeing someone smoke weed at a park or something like that. So the stigma has reduced a lot when it comes to cannabis use.
I think I just want to agree with everything that's been said as well. I know growing up, I essentially had no idea what 420 was because I grew up in a household that you didn't talk about a lot of these things. And so it's interesting to hear about how people have had very different experiences. And I think it really speaks to sometimes the importance of having open and honest conversations, with teens and with children as they're growing up as well about what's happening around them. I think we try to promote that as well in the sense of gathering more information so you can make decisions that are more informed. And I think certainly reflecting back on how I look at 420 now, it's with a very different perception rather than the stigma that was almost enforced upon me growing up in a background where a lot of this substance use, cannabis use, and otherwise was something that simply wasn't talked about. And so I think it's really great to have a day in many ways where we're able to talk about it and reflect on some of the changes that have happened for the past many years with legalization and before that as well.
I think what's really interesting about what we're talking about is that we are all folks who grew up with it being not legal. And so we have a very specific understanding of what 420 means because it's like this taboo thing that was cool, or like talk about skipping school, or because it was this thing that wasn't legal. But what's interesting about the generations that are coming, that how that 420 will unfold, for them it being something that is so normalized and very common to see just as much, or getting to the point where it's just like someone having a drink. So it's interesting to see how that'll shape their understanding of what 420 means. Will it lose its like rebellious significance? Will it change over time? Will it become something else? But just we all have a very specific understanding of what that means because of where we grew up pre and post legalization.
Is weed still cool post legalization is the question, I guess. It's like, are we just older now, or is it legal now? I don't know. And I know people were worried, like in terms of like the context of like pre and post legalization, that like legalization would make it more acceptable. And in some ways it's like it's gotten rid of the stigma, but like did it make it more cool? Arguably the opposite for young people. I don't know. Like Connor, when you were saying it's like a dad thing, I'm like, yeah, if I knew my dad was smoking weed in high school, I would not have thought it was as cool as I did.
Mm, no, not really. Like just getting into the context. One thing just focusing on like just the context of Canada is that a lot of people think that with the war on drugs, it's something that started like during the same time as the States in like the 70s and 80s. But I'm sorry, honestly, it's in the broader context because if you look at the past, Canada, like I said before, has taken a really prohibitionist approach to a lot of substance use and abuse. For example, even back in 1911, they introduced an Opium Drug Act, which penalized people who had possessions of opium-related drugs. Specifically, at that time, a lot of Chinese immigrants were in possession of that. So it's just interesting to see of how history kind of unfortunately repeated itself. And it's interesting to see now post legalization and shifting toward more of the harm reduction approach. Do we see a long term destabilization in terms of the fact that other minorities and racialized communities are being negatively affected? Is that going to change post legalization? So nothing more to add on. Just want to like add that question, see what's everyone's opinion on that.
I actually want to bring the perspective of like even beyond legalization and prohibition of substances, even for Indigenous people under the Indian Act, like we weren't even allowed to consume alcohol in public until like the mid 1900s, like the 1950s, 1960s. And so prohibition taking different forms in different communities, and obviously affecting white communities the least when it comes to actually being able to consume and consume openly and legally in a lot of ways. And so to see the way that it's manifested itself in different communities and affected it, looking 70 years later, how it's become so different in the way that we see certain types of people, specifically marginalized people, consuming in different ways. It really does shape the way that we understand consumption, depending on the context that we grew up in the communities we are in.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the impacts of legalization. I feel like there's so much to delve into there. Like there's so many different fields of how legalizing weed could impact society in like so many different ways. So I just want to like touch on some stats, and there has been a really big reduction in the selling and use of laced weed. Like that has been like a really big issue. Fentanyl laced weed, that was like a cause for overdosing and substance use related hospitalizations, but post legalization, 2/3 of users buy legal weed now. So that has been like a big change compared to before, where it was like really unsafe, especially for like younger folks who are trying to get weed off of like older people or like from dealers. You don't really know what's in it. So now it's been like a much safer form of using. And also Jelani has mentioned this a little bit. I'm gonna go more into it. Like there has been a significant reduction in cannabis possession charges and other cannabis related crime post legalization. So there has actually been like an 87% decrease in the possession charges amongst youth. And among the general population, it's been an 85% decrease. So that's like a huge change compared to before, because if people are just holding on to it and using it, they're not going to be convicted for that. And before legalization, and other people are mentioning this as well, there has always been a very clear racial divide within cannabis-related charges, and most of which have been taken up by Black and Indigenous folks. And before legalization, Black and Indigenous people were 3 times more likely to be arrested for possession of cannabis and cannabis-related crime compared to white individuals. And while the overall cannabis possession charges have been decreased, like I mentioned before, there's still that racial disparity, and it's still like 3 times more for Black and Indigenous individuals compared to white individuals. So like there has to be more research done on like racialized data when it comes to cannabis use and cannabis related convictions. And yeah, if anyone else wanted to, oh, I also wanted to mention how racialized data, especially when it comes to cannabis use, is really important for the community. It's a very important tool in enhancing transparency and building trust with communities who have been like historically affected by cannabis use and injustices relating to cannabis use specifically. Racialized data can help with public health efforts, and also recognizing how to better inform communities that use cannabis more, like especially communities that come from poverty. There is a higher chance of them using cannabis compared to other individuals. And it can also help with recognizing and how to improve policies and how changes can be implemented so that cannabis legalization can benefit marginalized communities more, since they're the ones that are most affected by cannabis use and cannabis related charges. So if anyone had anything else to add, I feel like there's so much to add to that. Definitely go ahead and jump in. I'm learning a lot of this stuff as I'm like going through this conversation, and also like the research that I've done prior to today. So yeah.
I really love the fact of you highlighting just the residual effects, even post legalization, what cannabis possession and cannabis related crimes had on marginalized communities, because a lot of people look at it just on the surface level, just of criminalization, which leads to the stigmatization, but it does affect so many other facets of life. Like in Canada, criminal records or simple cannabis positions, it blocks you from receiving any employment or any educational barriers, which are social determinants of how. Just overall, I just appreciate the fact that you highlighted the residual effects and how it affects many other parts of people's lives that people don't normally think about.
Yeah, I feel like overall, like people think that legalization has been a great experience for everyone, and I'm sure there have been so many benefits. But end of the day, racialized communities are still being affected. So that's definitely something that the government, policymakers, society in general can work towards changing.
I definitely agree because, while we made weed legal in 2019, it doesn't just automatically erase what happened in the past. So I think acknowledging that through research and um, better informed studies that are available to the public instead of just in journals are very important to decriminalize marijuana cannabis use.
That's great, Kavisha. Thank you. And agree with all 3 of you. The fact that, these communities, marginalized communities, have been disproportionately negatively impacted by prohibition and in some ways legalization, like in terms of if you're taking like more of like a capitalistic approach to it. There are promises made by the federal government that these marginalized groups that were negatively impacted would have a stake in profit when it came to legalization, and what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, that the same people that were enforcing prohibition are now the ones profiting off of it predominantly. So there's programs that have been made for Black, Indigenous, people of color to profit off of legalization, but it's still seen as difficult and not a priority. And to Jelani's point about racialized folks, being previously convicted due to minor possession of cannabis. So I was doing some research, and I think most folks on the call might know of this group called Cannabis Amnesty. So Cannabis Amnesty was created in 2018 when cannabis was legalized, and it is a group of really badass people. There's some lawyers on there, professors, advocates. There's Dr. Kwasi Owusu Bempe, who's featured in the course, and he was one of the frontliners for Cannabis Amnesty, and pretty much over the course of the past, I can't do math, 4 or 5 years, they've been really working at holding the government accountable for offering and helping people get pardons that were previously convicted with cannabis possession, and most of those people were Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor folks as well. And I was doing some research over the past couple of days, and it seems like last year the federal government has put together a bill called Bill C5, and I'll link it in the chat. It's this report that was created by Cannabis Amnesty, and what this bill states is that apparently, I haven't looked into it, but November 27th of 2023, the federal government has promised or had promised to look at those folks that were previously convicted with cannabis possession and remove any evidence of their convictions on their record. Now, this wouldn't be an expungement, which permanently in the eyes of the state remove that record, but it would be the same. I'm not too sure. I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand all of it. But it seems like there has been steps made, and Cannabis Amnesty, I feel like that I haven't seen them be as active, because it seems like that was really what they were working towards, was Bill C5. So it seems like the government has been held accountable. I'm not too sure if they followed through with that. I'm sure that there's a lot of bureaucracy, but what Bill C5 does is it removes it permanently and forever, and the state cannot go back on that. So I know that we talk about this pendulum swing, and when we're talking about harm reduction and drug laws, as we've seen, prohibition and legalization has only been around for 100, 200 years. So there's been this ongoing pendulum swing. So with this pendulum swing, those records will forever be cleared, hopefully. So that is amazing news. I'm going to link the report right now, and maybe when we post the video, we can also share it with folks. But I just wanted to shine a little bit of positivity that Cannabis Amnesty worked, and their efforts did work. So keep, advocacy is an effective way of making change, which is awesome. But also, as Jelani and Lavanya and Kavisha were saying, that there is that not entourage effect, but there's that legacy that prohibition has left, and that there's still work to be done. I just wanted to share that with you folks. I'm gonna link it.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I actually didn't know about that, because I mean, I'd certainly heard about the fact that pardons were a really difficult process. And I know earlier when cannabis was legalized, and it'd just been a couple of years, the amount of pardons was so low because it was costly, cumbersome, and really difficult to get through. And so they were recommending something like that at that time. And so it's really exciting to see that there's actually been change that's moving in the right direction. It's certainly one positive thing to take away.
It's super exciting, and the process is also free for anyone, because like you said, it's costly, and the government is now being held accountable in a way that they have to cover the costs. So it's not up to the individual, which also just reduces or increases accessibility for it, I guess. Yeah. I guess I'm curious for you folks, we're reflecting on, has it been 5 years since legalization, or is it 4 years? And I should know this. It's been some time. And we're talking and just reflecting on 5, thank you. And this year there's the legislative review that took place and recently came out, but curious what direction folks are wanting to see cannabis policy go, whether it is in terms of legislation or in terms of education. What do you see in the future for cannabis policy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kia. And I think there's a lot of things, a lot of aspects of policies that we can also advocate for. But I think one thing I think you already kind of mentioned it is that education component of the piece. And actually, Mikhail and I we talk about this on the workshops that we do for the Cannabis and Mental Health Project. And one thing that we do find is that there isn't enough education in terms of balanced education that talks about that gives you accurate information about cannabis, and putting in a non-stigmatizing lens. And I think that's needed. And actually, I just recall a conversation with Jelani actually from last summer. We had that get together with everybody, and we were talking about how the difference of how cannabis is portrayed in entertainment versus alcohol. And I guess, yeah, I mean, the difference is pretty drastic. In terms of cannabis, it's more like it's a drug that's like, oh, it's just funny, and you just see just one side of cannabis. But I mean, when you look at alcohol, you do see that side of, okay, it's like a pro-social substance, but you also see the other side depicting alcoholism and the potential negative side effects of alcohol. But we don't see that same level of concern for cannabis or any sort of representation for the other side, whether we're talking about cannabis-induced psychosis or other issues that may arise from cannabis. So I think just that education component, not in a sense that you are sensationalizing anything, that, oh, don't use it or anything like that. Just that, like, these are the facts, this is what it is. And I think youth want that as well, just giving the facts as facts without any of that sugarcoating or biased perspective, but just facts as facts, and more programs or more initiatives supporting that as well. I think which is also reflected on the legislative review that came out recently. I think they found that having more youth created, made by youth for youth programs that essentially reflect those things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Kind of going off of the legislative review and what Kia, you were saying about really taking a look at different populations and ensuring that their voices are amplified. It's much better to ensure that everyone is involved in the process of creating these policies, because at the end of the day, these policies are going to be used for them and in their best interest. So rather than having one population, for example, creating just a blanket policy that may only benefit one population as opposed to all, I think it's really important to incorporate different people's feedbacks. And that kind of relates to the legislative review. Like, one of the key findings that really resonated with me was the fact that young people had said that they don't have any resources that are accessible or accurate that they feel are tailored to them. And given that, like, I believe the National Cannabis Survey also mentioned this too, and it kind of corroborates what was said in the legislative review, but young people like us are the highest percentage of cannabis use in Canada and then also across the world. So it's really important that we are, like, our voices are heard in creating all these policies. So hopefully moving forward, we have like different age groups that are included when creating these, as well as different populations and backgrounds.
I just wanted to add.
Yeah, and even just, yeah, go ahead, Laiba.
You go.
I was just gonna say, the topic that you both were speaking about in terms of like youth and workshops or resources, I think it's really helpful for youth to hear, these kind of things from youth. And that's kind of what this whole project does. It's super important when you relate to the person that's speaking to you about these things. I think most of us, if not all of us, went through their program. At least in my school, we had like even a police officer come and talk to us. But it's not the same thing as, somebody like a police officer talking to you as it is of someone who you relate to, whether it's, in terms of representation, whether it's just in terms of age. I think that's super important. And also what Vijay said about, just giving the facts. I also felt like the cannabis education that I was given at a younger age, it was super exaggerated. It was like, even the way it's depicted in the media, it really gave you sorry, it gave you us like, sorry, my video went blurry. Give me a second. Jump scare. Yeah, I just think it's helpful to be honest about what the implications are, positive or negative, so that the person actually believes what you're saying, right? I feel like if you tell them that everyone's obviously cannabis experience is going to be different, but if you're really dramatizing it and then that's not the experience someone has, they're not going to believe you, even of the like the harmful effects that probably are real and will happen. So that's just what I wanted to say. I'm going to fix my video, so ignore me.
It's like
Yeah,
the
that's
cannabis
really well
companies heard you
said.
talking. I just have one more point to add on to them, and I like, and it made me when you were talking about the whole cop coming to or the police coming to school, and just made me think about that same experience I had as well. And I guess what came out of the experience was that you just became more scared to consume because of the potential of being um, arrested or having a charge, rather than okay, well, why? What are the reasons why I shouldn't consume or should consume, and what are potential um side effects? It wasn't that. It was more like, okay, if I do use the substance, might get locked up or something like that. And I think that's the wrong approach. It's and when you as you get older and you realize that's not really the case, I think you have less of a trust with the educational system that taught you that as well. So it has this double negative effect that you don't even trust that education system anymore as well. Um, yeah, yeah.
No, definitely. I do think moving from that fear mongering approach into more of this harm reduction lens that we do here in our work is definitely beneficial. That really made me reflect on, I don't know if anyone else also had this. I know we have some people from Toronto here, but the racing against drugs, like education thing in Ontario schools, definitely Toronto schools. Thinking back, I'm like, how was that even okay that even happened? Um, did not work. Like you mentioned, VJ, it just instills this fear in young people, and that's not okay. And I think that's why there was such a stigma surrounding cannabis use, and particularly among young people at the time. So hopefully, I guess that's my one hope for everything post legalization, that folks feel more comfortable to have these conversations, whether it be with friends, family, healthcare workers, whatever it may be, and just be more compassionate with our conversations with one another.
I think I just wanted to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kadisha.
Okay. I just wanted to add, like, not to circle back, but to the point you said about like youth just not knowing about the resources. I I went to high school and everything in like my rural area in Ontario, and I only just found out at 24 the that there are like at least 10 organizations in my area that work with students who have substance use issues, some uh, harm reduction, and um, those kinds of programs. And at 24, I found them out. So to think that back then that there was help for youth and that we just didn't know about it, that our school board particularly was just strict about who they let in, wasn't, because back then it was very much about just fully preventative rather than harm reduction. And I agree with VJ in saying like that's just the wrong approach because it's just fear mongering and doesn't give um, youth the right to really choose for themselves so what they think is a healthy approach and what they don't think is healthy.
I think I just wanted to build and agree off of everything that Kadisha, VJ, and Mikhail, you all have said. I think at the end of the day, youth and other folks are going to use cannabis. Some people will choose to use and some people will choose not to use. And I think, Michaela, what you were saying about harm reduction is just so important. I know recently there was an update to the lower risk cannabis use guidelines. And they talked about various different strategies that if you are deciding to use cannabis, what can you do to reduce the risk of having any kind of adverse events? So things such as reducing how frequently you use, or thinking about trying other methods of consuming, or reducing using multiple substances at the same time. And so I think when you don't have a lot of that education or talking about cannabis use, different ways to use, what are the effects, you also miss out on the opportunity to support those that are using and being able to reduce some of their harms. And so I think it's so important not only to allow people to make informed choices, but also to make choices that are best for their health and their bodies, depending on what they think works for them. And so I think that harm reduction piece is certainly something that we've been working on, and I've seen so many other organizations focus on, not just in cannabis use, but in all other substances as well. And certainly something I hope to see moving forward as well when we're looking at cannabis policy and what that looks like in the future.
To add to this conversation, to touch back on this, I feel like the fear mongering that we learned, or well, I particularly was subjected to in elementary school, was very extreme from what I understand of cannabis use now. I feel like it was this, if you use, it's immediately considered abuse and it's immediate death. You know, there's no in between, and it kind of broadens and confuses your spectrum of this understanding of how it works and where to begin to understand and how to begin to understand what it means to use and how to use. And so I feel was just very unnecessary, a little too far for what it should have been. And I do agree with everything that's been said so far, as this very preventative approach, which I don't feel like is realistic. And I feel like we do need to be encouraging for this path towards education and just a better understanding of, in a way, just how things work. I feel like an impact of legalization that's often overlooked when discussing like its social implications, its contribution towards job creation. I feel like historically those who have sold weed pre-legalization have committed it a lot of the times for financial purposes, and it was just considered this easy way to earn a stable cash flow, especially as like a side hustle in business. And so it has definitely had a substantial impact on our job creation within just various sectors of the economy. So beyond direct employment opportunities and marijuana cultivation or processing and retail, I feel like there's indirect jobs that are created as well in related industries like packaging or transportation and marketing. I just wanted to talk about how I feel like legalization has just opened up a range of business opportunities within the cannabis industry. And so it's helped in not only just stimulating the economy, but also reducing unemployment rates in communities.
I wanted to add on to that, just tying back to something we were talking about earlier. I read this somewhere, so I'm not sure how accurate it is, don't quote me, but I do remember reading that, that despite, the legal cannabis market increasing, there's still a lot of barriers to entry for marginalized people of color, some of those topics we were talking about in terms of social equity. So I think, the fees that are higher and, being able to own that business legally, I feel like there's still a lot of, economic barriers that exist for marginalized communities that I think are also important to take into consideration. But definitely a great point, Herlene.
I just want to add one quick thing building off of what Herlene and Liba have both said. Just to kind of summarize, because I know we are going to shift it. So we're coming up on the hour and we want to talk about like harm reduction and like safe celebration, but just kind of like recognizing legalization as an opportunity and the opportunities that have come out of it, both like economic opportunities for conversations and education, like Vijay and Michaela were talking about, opportunities for like social justice reparations, which I think we've all kind of talked about. And like, we're getting closer to some of them, I think particularly like the social justice reparation piece, we're like still maybe a little bit ways away. Like I know there was a program in Oakland that was like priority for dispensary licensing went to people that had prior cannabis convictions. Like they were literally trying to be like, if you were negatively impacted by prohibition, you should be like first in line to like benefit from the like economic opportunities. But then like, I don't know, one of the studies that came out about like, I don't know, the demographics of cannabis CEOs in Canada was like not reflecting a very social justice oriented approach. But yeah, I just want to kind of summarize what everyone was already saying. I don't want to say too much about it before we shift into the, well, I guess that's the other thing is like legalization or policy reform as an opportunity for harm reduction, because sometimes the harms are the policies and the way they're being enforced. But I don't know. That's all I wanted to say, and I don't know if we want to shift over to the harm reduction conversation more to kind of wrap things up, or if there were any final points about the policies and social impacts of legalization before we shift over to that.
I think it was important that you brought up how like people in power or like in these leadership positions within like the cannabis industry are, it's dominated mostly by like white males. And there was actually a stat that I read. I think only like 14% were like people of color and like women, which I thought was crazy. And I think that kind of draws parallels with like even kind of unrelated, but like construction that happens within like marginalized communities. Like those communities are subject to gentrification. So you want these communities to benefit from any project that's happening. And that's kind of the same idea that's happening with, you know, cannabis, the cannabis industry and like cannabis stores. Like we want the people that are using cannabis to benefit from that. And then like we're not really sure if that's actually happening. So I thought that was really interesting that you brought it up, because I was reading about that today as well.
I get upset about the gentrification of cannabis all the time, honestly. Like things that used to feel radical. Like I don't know, this is tangential, but like veganism, where I used to be like, oh, it's like a radical subversion of capitalism because we're like making all our food. But now it's like I see a vegan restaurant and I'm like, oh, that's a red flag for gentrification. Ha ha ha.
I think shifting more towards that harm reduction piece, like not only the policies need to be more harm reductionist, but also the way that we take care of each other in the communities that we are in. I think sometimes we get caught on being very cannabis positive without understanding that that looks differently for everyone. And so understanding that there is nuance also in experience, there's nuance in your experience in the way that it changes, the way that it grows or shrinks or moves around. And I think it's always really important to be very open-minded when we're having these conversations and not steer towards one direction or the other, because they're both not beneficial. It's really good to have that open mindedness, to have those conversations open to learning and to changing the way that we see the way you see your consumption, the way that you see the consumption of others, and just the way that can change. You know, if you're in the way that you're also consuming. And so sometimes those spaces can tend to be very cannabis forward, and then we don't have those conversations about the harms that could happen, and then sometimes that puts us in a tricky position. So for me, it's really about like that openness piece, those conversations that need to happen, and the way that we take care of each other throughout that journey, and the way that we can show up for each other, even if that's just like a text to be like, hey, how's it going? Or it's bringing over snacks, or it's, you know, sitting down to watch a movie when someone's having a bad trip. There's a lot of ways that we can take care of each other as a community, and it's really important to put those into action.
Nobody wants to follow that up. No, everyone's like, okay, perfect, Connor, thanks. I could tell also you're like, I have to leave at 7 because you were just speed running all of your harm reduction cannabis care tips. They were so good. Was I guess well, that was like the last thing. I guess it's a great segue into the last thing that we wanted to touch on, which was just like, what does cannabis harm reduction look like for everyone on the call? How are we practicing it in our own lives? I like, Connor, that you mentioned bringing snacks. I think that is an underrated harm reduction tool in so many facets, and also just like spending intentional time with our friends and like checking in on them. Those are like really kind of like under the radar harm reduction tips, but I don't know. And I know, Hargan, you already listed off some good ones, but I don't know if we want to like open it up and talk about that collectively a little bit more. Okay, bye, Connor. Thank you. Bye.
I think kind of bouncing off what Connor and Heath, what you guys were talking about, I've never personally experienced this, but I know other people who have. I think it's really important to know the people, who you're gonna be using cannabis with and using weed. Like if you're around a group of people and you're at like a social setting and you're around strangers or people that you don't know, then that might not be a safe option compared to like smoking with a friend or using with a friend. So I think, you know, knowing the people that you're doing these things with is really important when it comes to harm reduction, especially if it's like your first time using, because you don't know, it's your first time. You might have a bad trip, you might experience like hallucinations, like that's a thing. You might experience paranoia. There's so many things that every individual person can be experiencing. And especially because it's your first time, you wouldn't know. So I think like understanding yourself, understanding your environment and the people around you prior to using is very important when it comes to harm reduction.
I love that, Lavanya, and I think that's something as like I'm someone that uses weed and like uses substances in general, and I think just like really understanding the like environment that I might potentially be in and the people I'm using around. And personally for me, this 420, I actually in the little like short video I was talking about this. I'm not participating for like probably the first time since I was like 15. I'm taking a tea break. And so I guess as a harm reduction tip, recognizing that like, hey, you also don't have to consume on 420. You can also just hang out with your friends that may or may not be using weed. As Connor says, you can bring snacks, check in with them, support them. But like don't feel necessarily pressured or like you have to celebrate 420. It's a very weird thing for me where I'm really used to. I'm like, do I have like a cannabis beverage? And I'm like, girl, you don't have to. No one's forcing you to. So like there's different ways to celebrate and honor it in community. Yeah, that'd be my little tip.
I'm just gonna read.
I was just say a tea break is a tolerance break for anyone in the room who doesn't
Thank you,
know.
thank
I
you.
assume everybody, I don't know, I don't know. People are coming with different knowledges. Sorry, Live, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please go ahead.
Thank you for saying that because I genuinely thought it was related to like tea drinking. So I was like, do you? Teas are great. But that's great. I just wanted to kind of reiterate what I said earlier on. With harm reduction, I think you know, equipping youth with knowledge that comes from youth to make responsible decisions is really important. I think when you hear it from people who you can relate to, it just resonates with you more. And I think definitely having community-based harm reduction initiatives is also important. And again, yeah, not like VJ already said, like saying the facts as they are and not over-exaggerating things and not having a bias towards any side and just saying things as they are. I think it's going to be really helpful for education and awareness.
I also think that like, you know, especially prior to joining like these mental health initiatives, anytime I would think harm reduction, I would think like more hardcore substances like heroin and like, you know, things that I would hear about on the news, like opioids, like serious drugs. And like when I think about weed, I never really thought like harm reduction would be a thing like years prior when I was younger, you know. And I think you know, tying back to what Liva and everyone else was saying, that education piece is so important because now that it's legal, there are going to be a lot of youth, especially who think like, okay, this is safe, it's fine for me to use. Where's the education coming from? Like, who's telling me how much I can use? Like, you know, like there are people that when you go to the store, they'll tell you a little bit about it, but like half the time when you walk in, from like what I hear from like friends and other people, like they just kind of expect you to know, and then you just buy your like what it is you want to use without really knowing about everything that comes with using cannabis. So yeah, that education piece is really important.
I'd like to say that on education, I think since there are so many different types of legal cannabis available, it's important to research what you want to use because different ways of consuming cannabis will give you a different effect, and knowing what effect is going to give you, I think, is part of something that's going to keep you safe.
And I'll just kind of add on here. Same with the education piece. I think education itself is a form of harm reduction because the landscape of cannabis, especially since legalization, is changing all the time. And one way it's changing is the the amount of THC in the products that we consume. So in that sense, educating yourself on like what percentage, or even educating yourself on what percentage you may be comfortable with, and taking things slowly and not going into the products that may have very high potency, and maybe starting up at a smaller one and then building up to that, whatever you feel comfortable with. So taking it slowly, taking it easy, and constantly educating yourself so that you're keeping up with the like really rapidly evolving landscape of the cannabis industry right now.
I just wanted to add quickly, just because we had a cool conversation about this a couple of weeks ago. I think one of the other aspects that I wanted to mention, in addition to cannabis use for individuals who are using multiple substances, there's different risks that can come with using substances at the same time. And so one of the cool tips that I think we chatted about with an expert on the topic was just thinking about why you're using every substance, and really trying to understand a bit more about what the interactions are and how you can minimize harm. So things like using cannabis at one time and not trying to mix it with other substances, or if you're using things like alcohol, trying not to use cannabis at the same time, or reducing the amount that you use to prevent any kind of negative harms that could happen. And so for individuals who do use multiple substances, I think it's important to take into mind some of those other pieces around harm reduction as well, in addition to what everyone has already mentioned.
Go ahead, Heath.
I'm like so tempted to just try and summarize what everyone has said, but I'm just like, I can't summarize. I don't know. There's been so many like good points that everyone's made that like, I think the only thing that I would add, rather than trying to summarize, just like adding, I don't know, my own take, I guess, with like regards to the cannabis harm reduction piece on 420 and forever for always, is like, I don't know how to frame it, but like I feel like the education we got was like, just say no. It's like telling us what to say and like how to say no to drugs. That's fine if it works for some people. And I know that like a lot of like parents are like, how to like feel like they don't know what to say about substance use. And like, even, I don't know, in this conversation, it can be like nerve-wracking to be like, I'm not an expert, I don't know what to say. But I think sometimes like the bigger thing also is just like being comfortable to like ask the questions about substances, like about like whatever it is, like, and it could be like as simple as like if someone is offering you a vape pen, asking like, what is in the vape pen, how strong is it weed, is it nicotine, I don't know. Or like if you're going to a party, asking like, can I bring edibles to the party, is that chill or is that like not the vibe? Like just like being comfortable asking questions is like a big thing that is like a win out of legalization. Being like, if you're a parent and your kid or someone in your life is like coming to you with questions, being able to like be curious about what they're asking also, and like look for answers together. I don't know. I'm like, I don't know if it's like a tangible thing. But just like asking questions is good, and asking yourself, like, where are you at? Asking your friends how they're doing. I don't know. And it's not a conventional harm reduction tip, but just like asking questions is good. I don't know. That's what I'll say. It's not articulate, but that's what I felt compelled to say and add. Thank you.
No, I think everyone has mentioned some great tips for harm reduction, and these can be used year round. Just because we have 420 coming up doesn't mean you just limit these tips to the one day of the year. You continue to use them throughout the year. So hopefully those that are going to be celebrating keep these in mind if they didn't already know them, but just have them practice throughout the year when it comes to mental health, substance use, whatever it may be. And I'm seeing another comment, and having a plan to get home. That is correct. That would be very helpful. So I'm just gonna open the floor if anyone else has any other comments before we give it a little wrap up. No, are we good?
Take
Okay.
the course.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I guess that kind of brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you all so much for sharing your different perspectives. I know I've learned a lot just in this conversation, and I hope those that are watching right now also learned a lot. We definitely encourage you to take our Cannabis and Mental Health course. It's a free 90-minute certificate course that is housed on our website. I believe we'll be putting the links in the description box. And if you're watching this on the website, you have easy access to it as well. Another thing that I did want to mention, we are doing workshops that you can come to. There's a section on our website. We'll also link that below. And here you'll just get a facilitated tour through our resources, how to use them in your community if you work with youth or if you just want to learn more. So I encourage you to join that. And yeah, that kind of brings us to the end. I'm wishing you all a very happy 420 if you're celebrating. And yeah.